This
Sure,
conference
sounds
will
good.
now
Thanks.
be recorded.
Great. Well, thanks, Pam. Let's see, where to start? So I graduated undergrad with a degree in political science, and as people with those degrees do, applied and went to law school. Had a good time in law school. Ended up joining a law firm right out of law school, but kind of as I went through law school, I was pretty sure that I wanted to be on the growth side of business. I think you learn very quickly as a lawyer that your job is to document things, like document a lot of the activities that happen around growth, whether it's funding growth or actual decisions that growth leaders make. And I wanted sort of a bigger part of strategy and ops. So I got in touch with Pam, and we worked through my application. We really prepped with cases and a lot of the qualitative stuff. And I actually quit my law firm about a year in, cold, like with no offer outstanding. I wanted time to prepare, so I quit, and then I took like 2 months to prepare hard, and then I jumped in and went into BCG recruiting, got the offer, and haven't looked back. So in retrospect, it's actually a terrifying thing. I try not to like look back retrospectively. I'm not sure I would advise myself to do that, but it kind of all worked out, and now we call it courage as opposed to foolhardiness. So that's a bit of my background. Happy to talk about it a bit more afterwards. I understand we have some Q&A, so we can talk a bit more after the case. Back to you, Pam.
Perfect. Awesome. Thanks, Matthew. So a couple ground rules and suggestions for everyone. Again, please put yourself on mute. Like I said, there will hopefully be some time at the end for some questions. You can either ask them live or put them in the chat. I recommend 1 to 2 approaches for this session. So either sit back and listen to Matthew and maybe take a few notes and write down any questions that you have. The other approach is to kind of work the case as we go along so that you have a chance to compare and contrast. I mean, again, as we're recording, you'll be able to listen to it after the fact. And then, probably about 35-ish minutes, we'll end the case, and then we will go into that Q&A. All right? So with that,
Pam, are we going to pause? Are we going to pause in the middle of the case to do questions and answers on like what just happened, or are we going to kind of go continuously through?
I think we're going to go continuously, if that's
cool.
Unless you feel like there's something dramatic that we ought to talk about.
Great. All right. Sure. I doubt it.
Okay. I hope not. I hope not. Okay. With that, I'm going to give Matthew the background of the case, and we will kick off from there. All right. So, Matthew, let me tell you a little bit about the business problem that I'm going to have you give your attention to and your thinking. So this is a circumstance where you happen to be on vacation and you were traveling in the country of Greece recently. You may remember it was a beautiful trip. You had a lot of fun, you and your friends. And while you were there, you happened to notice a really interesting product called Beauty and the Bees. And as someone who's a consultant with a curious mind, you wanted to learn more about this because it's not a product that you recognize being sold in the United States. And so you reached out to the company. You happened to get a conversation with their chief strategy officer. And you learned a couple of things about Beauty and the Bees. So first of all, it's a company headquartered in Greece, in Athens, and their product focus is organic personal care products. What that means is things like shampoo, lotion, soap, lip balm. What is particularly unique about their products is that they are organic, but they are also made with byproducts that come from bees, hence the name Beauty and the Bees. The other thing you learned about the company, and one of the reasons why you have not seen them in the United States, is that several years ago they attempted to enter the U.S. market. It was by all measures a failure. And after a couple of years, they pulled back out of the market. Well, now, and your call is actually very timely, they have been rethinking about launching in the United States. They think that they're a little bit smarter. They have some additional capabilities, and you have agreed to help them think about their market re-entry into the United States. And so what I'd like for you to do is establish a strategy that would define how they should relaunch in the United States and this time achieve a more profitable business.
Okay. All right, so let me make sure we're all on the same page here. This is a Greek company. We don't know what their main sales channels are. We don't know what countries, what markets they're in currently. What we do know, though, is they do organic personal care stuff, shampoo, soap, lip balm. So I'm thinking, I don't know, similar to what Coty does, or like Burt's Bees, or on like the personal care space here in the U.S. That's because of what I'm thinking at the moment. They tried to enter the U.S., but that was a failed experiment, and they pulled out. They're thinking about doing it again, and they're looking for a strategy on how, both whether and how to enter. Does that sound right?
That does sound right.
Okay, so I have some immediate thoughts. I need to take some time to organize them, but I do have some questions I want to start with before we even get there, just so I have a sense. What is the chairman of this company looking for in terms of a return profile?
Tell me more specifically what you're looking for. Are you looking for a metric?
Yeah, I'm looking for some kind of metric. Are they looking to grab as much revenue as they can, just boost their sales without much margin target? Are they looking for specific? Are they very disciplined in terms of margin? They want very sustainable growth. Kind of what is their desired goal here?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it is a small family-owned business. It is private. They have no outside investment. They have no debt capital. And so because it is an organic premium product, they would like to keep the margins that they currently have in their present business, which are slightly above average for the personal care market. They do not have to have a aggressive penetration of the U.S. market. They can certainly have something that is, manageable, sustainable, and especially in the first couple of years, I think that they would feel comfortable with strong margins. They do not want to give up margins for growth.
Okay, that's helpful. That's very, and it makes sense because they are a small family-owned business. All right, so they entered the U.S. a couple of years ago. As I'm working through whether this is a good idea and how they might do it differently this time, help me understand. You mentioned earlier they developed some additional capabilities. If you happen to know what those are, that'd be helpful. But I'm specifically thinking more targeted question is, what markets are they in now? It's different if, for example, if they say we are in like the rest of the world X the U.S., that's a very different scenario than they are just in the Baltics or they're just in the Mediterranean. What markets are they in, and how much experience do they have managing outside of Greece?
Sure. So they obviously started in Greece, in Athens. They have company-owned stores, call them kind of flagship stores. The next point of expansion was, interestingly, they actually went to Japan, and a lot of it had to do with Japanese tourists that were coming to Greece, loved the product, and they went into a couple of really high-end, high-traffic shopping areas, again, with kind of a company-owned flagship store. The next market that they went into was the Czech Republic. Again, very strange choice, but they had a lot of, interest from that country. There, they are partnering with one of the high-end retailers. They have kind of a boutique within a department store. And then the most recent market that they've entered is the United Kingdom, largely in London, and that came about through a relationship where they met a couple of very aggressive and innovative boutique hotel owners who wanted custom products to not only put in the spas, but also in the hotel rooms. And so they chose to expand into that market largely because of a very unique relationship. At the time that they went into the U.S. previously, they had not done any international expansions. They had only really been operating successfully, but only in Greece at the time.
Got it. Okay, that's helpful. So what I heard from you is that they have their own company flagship stores. So they do have some experience with retail, actually brick and mortar retail. They have experience managing distribution to high-end boutiques and to hotels. It doesn't sound like they really do e-commerce. Does that sound right?
Not a lot. As you can imagine, the European market is not as advanced, and especially not in Greece, Czech Republic. So they do have a web presence, but it's really a marketing page.
Got it. Okay. I think I have enough right now. Why don't you give me 30 seconds or a minute even, just to give me some time to organize my thoughts. Does that work?
Very good.
Perfect. Thanks. All right, sounds good. So I want to cover 3 topics today. I think I'll need your help on all 3 because I think you'll have some information that I need. I think I just want to structure this kind of chronologically. So the first question I think we have to answer is, should they enter? And to answer that question, we should look at a couple things. One is the size of the U.S. market, what kind of sales they can expect, certainly how big the market is, and then we look at we can do a little competitor landscape scan and figure out what percentage or what part of that market they can take. And then we should also take a look at the kind of preferred channels that people buy personal care products here in the U.S. I have a hypothesis on this, and we can get into that later. But the next question we need to answer then, if we answer affirmatively that they should enter, is how should they enter? And I think there's kind of 2 questions. One is just we need to look at what the economics of this looks like. So I would need to understand how much sales they would need in order to be able to operate at scale, given the investment that's going to be needed. The product is made in Greece. They're managed in Greece. They would need some kind of presence in the U.S., and we need to figure out what the economics of all that looks like. And then the second part of figuring out how to enter is to get a sense for what the path to sustainable growth looks like. Again, I have hypotheses, we can get into that, but we need to answer both of those questions to really answer the question of how they do this. And then the third is a bit further down the road, and they're a private company, but it's important for us to figure out how the company, what their end game is. Are they looking to exit and sell off their U.S. business? Are they looking to just add this to the portfolio and have this just generate cash? We should have that discussion on what winning means, what a victory condition looks like, and we can kind of structure the business accordingly. So if that's okay with you, that sounds right. I have some hypotheses I want to test.
Sure.
Okay, so my initial hypothesis, and you can validate this, I think the personal care market in the premium and organic segment, I think that's double-digit growth over the last 5 years. I think that's one of the few bright spots in retail. Does that sound right to you, or am I misremembering?
No, you are correct. I mean, this is the fastest growing area of personal care. It's today about 10% of personal care,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's definitely growing in the 20-25% per year, where the rest of this market is fairly flat.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. So great. So that sounds attractive. So from a growth perspective, that sounds like, okay, looking at the U.S. seems like it makes sense. The second is, let's figure out how big this market is. Now, do you happen to have any data on how big this opportunity looks like? I have, I can do a quick back of the envelope for you, but if you have verified data, that would be fantastic.
No, I actually don't have it at the ready, so it would be great if maybe you would do a good back of the envelope estimate for us.
Perfect. All right, so we'll definitely have to do that. Before I jump into that, there are two other considerations. The second is competitors. Once we've sized the market, it'd be helpful to understand what percent of the market we can realistically take. I'm not too familiar with, I don't walk into Sephora that often, but I would have to assume pretty much all the competitors are going to be in there. I have no idea whether it's fragmented or consolidated. My hypothesis is that it's fragmented, and there's an opportunity here for us to take some share. Is that right? The ballpark, I don't know, 5-10% share of this market?
Yes, you are correct. The highest end part of this market is incredibly fragmented. There's all these very small companies, extremely niche, that have been bringing products into the marketplace. Now, of course, there are some incredibly large players like Procter & Gamble and Unilever who have moved into the organic space, but they really still have a very different positioning.
Got it. Okay, so it sounds like our main competition really is a very niche and fragmented market. So let's just assume we can take something like 5% if we're successful. Great. And then the final consideration we need to discuss later, I'm actually going to table this, is we need to have a serious discussion about channels. And I think that kind of bleeds over a little bit into how we would enter kind of the operating model. So let's leave that aside. Mm-hmm. And I want to go back to size. And let's kind of go with a couple assumptions and see if we can get to a reasonable size of this market. Does that work?
That sounds great.
All right, perfect. So this is the U.S. So I think that makes sense for us to kind of do this top down. When I actually live pretty close to Sephora here, and I walk past on the way to work. There's a lot of women, and there's a lot of women. I'd say somewhere between, as young as their early 20s and maybe as old as their late 50s. So that's kind of my hypothesis of the target market. To get there, let's just say the U.S. has got about 320 million people. Say about half of those is women, half of those is men. So half of 320 is 160 million. And I think my hypothesis is probably pretty spot on in terms of what Sephora's customers are. We'd want to verify this by tracking down some foot traffic data for Sephora as kind of just our rough market target customer. So let's say there's kind of 4 age ranges, right? There's like 0 to 20, 20 to 40, 40 to 60, 60 to 80. I do think it's the kind of middle range there. So let's say half of 160 million is the age range of women we're talking about here. That puts us at 80 million-ish people. So let's say that's 80 million people. I don't want to put a price tag on this now. That's something for market research later. Let's stick with people, and we can make some smart assumptions later. For now, let's actually just back into that by taking a look at competition. So with 80 million people, we have to go down one of two paths, we assume. The first question is, are people totally brand exclusive? So if people start using Beauty and the Bees, are they going to stop using, I don't know, pick whatever boutique premium organic like Whole Foods product you see? What's your sense here as the chief strategy officer? Is this like the sort of thing where people tend to use us in conjunction with other people, or can I just say, you know what, for simplicity's sake, let's put 5% of 80 million, say it's roughly our penetration?
I do think that people will pick multiple niche brands, but I think it's perfectly okay if you want to simplify that assumption for this analysis.
Yeah, great. So let's just back the envelope it and say 5% of 80 million people is kind of roughly the number of customers we have. So 10% of 80 million is 8 million, so therefore 5% is 4 million. We can assume there's about 4 million people who will be our customers. So there's two analyses we need to do. One is a pricing one, and I think it's relatively, at this stage, it's not worth trying to reprice and try to do some sophisticated things in the U.S. market. We can take a look in U.S. dollars converted, roughly what the products are currently. So I'll ask you that in a second. But the second then is, once we get the pricing, we should move into talking about sales channels, and once we determine the sales channels, what the economics of this U.S. business would look like. So backing up, let's talk about pricing. What are you guys selling for in Greece? Like premium product? What are we talking about? Like $50 shampoos, or what's the average selling price here for your SKUs?
Yeah, so if we convert, euros to dollars, the average bottle runs about $15, but you're also not talking about a, 7-Eleven big gulp size. You're talking about, most of their bottles are, 8 to 12
tiny
ounces. They're tiny.
Yeah.
But a unit, typically they're units, a unit sale, and they can measure this against some of their other transactions in other countries. It's about $15 a unit.
Great. So let's say $15 per unit. We don't need to get too specific at this stage. That's my sense. I anticipate us obviously needing to deep dive this later. So for the sake of this proposal, let's just say it's $15 per unit. So if you say 15 times 4, let's see, 4 times is 40 plus 20. So you are talking $60 million in sales per year. That's roughly what we think our sales figure will be. Now, keep in mind that you told me that the family here cares a lot about sustainable growth, cares a lot about maintaining their margins. One way of doing it, I had initially proposed that we figure out what their sales channel would be and then talk about how much of a cost. Another way of doing this is to say, what is our target and what sales channels do will we have to be able to make do with? So given that we already have sales, and I'm guessing you already have some sense what the target margin will be, we can back into what a target profit might look like, the target profit. So what is their current margins, or at least what's the desired margin they're hoping to maintain?
Today they get a contribution margin of about $10 a unit.
Mm-hmm.
That could potentially change because that, assumes sales across Europe, although that's roughly about the same that they're getting in Japan. So we could probably extrapolate that to the U.S. market.
So their operating margins are roughly 66%, even in Japan.
Yes.
Per unit.
It's a well-run company.
It is a very well-run company. Very nice. So you know what? Let's just, for the sake of simplicity, let's not do 66. Let's just, since we have the number 60 million sales, let's say, let me just think about this for a second here. Yeah, you know what? Let's just say 2/3. So let's assume that was actually 66 million, and we'll cut that up. Say 11 million is cost. They're going to keep about 55. Give me a moment here. The pen's rounding. Let me get the other pen here. All right, so we said that we had 66 million in sales, and we're maintaining a margin of 66%, right? So 2/3 of 66 is times 2 or 3. So that is 44. So let's say around 40 million in profit. Jeez. So that's what we're targeting here. 20 million in cost. Okay, so the target profit that we need to maintain is 40 million in annual profits. Do you agree with that so far, or does that sound unattainable? I want to do a gut check.
It might be a little bit large given what they've experienced in other countries, just because they tend to have one or two retail locations. But obviously the US market is much larger, but I think it's something, just the weight of it could be a little bit bigger than what they're used to.
Okay. So why don't we say conservatively that the U.S., especially as they're starting out, is not going to be their highest margin country. I think that makes sense. I think it would be difficult, given their previous experience there, to say we're going to have the same success, high level success that we've had in the rest of the world. So why don't we say instead of 40, they're aiming for like a 50% margin. It comes out to be roughly $30 million a year. Does that sound a lot more doable, building in a little bit of cushion there?
I mean, I think so. The question is, how would you assess if that was doable? What factors would you consider?
We back into it. We should figure out how many units we would realistically need to sell. So what did our math was what? We said 60 million in sales, right? Mm-hmm. 60 million in sales. Because we said there were 4 million people buying one bottle each, basically. 4 million bottles. What is 4 million bottles? I want to get a sense for whether the costs are actually reasonable here. So 4 million bottles divided by how many? 20. We said 20 million in costs divided by 4 million bottles says about $5 in cost per bottle. My assessment of that is that that's a little optimistic in terms of cost structure for the 66%. So I agree with you there. Even if we say the costs are 30 million per bottle divided by 4, that's 6, 7, 8, $8 per bottle. That sounds a bit more reasonable. You're saying that in order to make 4 million sales, we would have to accept $8 in cost per bottle. Question is whether that's doable. I would want to do some benchmarking against what our current costs are. You say that our margins are 66% in something as high end as Japan, which is pretty far afield. And that's a market that has tremendous competition from great products there. Elsewhere, and we are running flagship stores, that tends to eat up margin really fast. I think that sounds like a reasonable cost to me, to say $8 in cost to maintain 50 per bottle. Seems like a very reasonable per unit cost to me.
Yep. So my other question, Matthew, the 4 million in sales, does that seem achievable for a new entrant to a highly competitive, although fragmented market? How would you test that?
My initial gut would to say that 4 million in sales in the first year is completely unrealistic. I think that is something that is ultimately possible. The way I would test it would be a mix of benchmarking and actual historical experience of the company. So I'd want to do two things. I would want to find similar products in the U.S. that have launched recently in the categories we're talking about, and take a look at what their sales numbers looked like over like a 5-year period. And I'd also want to take a look at more accurate numbers, which would be our own SKUs, sales velocity or distribution, whatever, and take a look at that in the UK, maybe as a very comparable market. So I'd want to take a look at those numbers and assess whether that's reasonable. I assume you don't have that data here, but I think that's
I don't.
I think for now we can assume that it sounds doable to me, given how fragmented the market is, and I have a hypothesis for what our distribution strategy would look like. And I think given that distribution strategy, I think that is possible, but it is absolutely critical that after we do this exercise, as a next step, that we look at comparables and figure out whether that is a reasonable assumption that we made.
Fair. So tell me more about what you're thinking in terms of the distribution.
In order to hit 4 million units of sales, you are going to have to go mass market. And mass market doesn't mean like Target and Walmart, because that's not where extremely premium and organic things are being sold. But I strongly doubt you're going to be doing 4 million in sales in the United States based on purely flagship stores alone, or just doing e-commerce alone. There's just the way American consumers shop tends to be still in brick and mortar retail. There's a reason why Sephora has done really, really well. There's a reason why Whole Foods is still a strong distributor for these kind of products. So the question is how you get from where we are now with zero presence to a strong presence in the kind of retail that is successful and has a lot of foot traffic. That's my initial hypothesis. Again, as a next step, I'd want to test that against the experience of things like Coty and Burt's Bees and some of the other kind of more premium products. But I want to pause and get a sense for whether you think that hypothesis is the right one to be testing.
So it's an interesting question. I think that the client, Beauty and the Bees, is hesitant to do anything that's mass market. I think that they might be willing to take 2 or 3 years to establish a footprint more slowly, and keep margin over, raw dollars. So if you set aside the 30 million margin, and let's say that, we didn't care so much about the total margin, but we cared more about the margin percent, but they wanted to have a strong penetration to get their foothold and kind of build their confidence and momentum. What strategies might that open up for you?
That makes sense. So it sounds like when you say foothold, that sounds like really capturing the imagination of some of the customers here. And for me, that's there's a sales strategy aspect and there's a marketing strategy aspect. So we can have a discussion about marketing later. I don't think that's more of a spend question. In terms of entry, I would think you would want to enter in a variety of channels. And I think because the same products that are being sold very well around the world will be the same ones being sold here, I think you have an opportunity to you can either choose partners or find distributors that have these kind of customers and show them, you can show sales velocity, right? You have evidence of sales velocity through your own stores, through the hotel gift shops, and also at the high-end premium shops in Japan. So I would be looking at starting maybe your own flagship store for sure. And I would pick a location very, very carefully. My hypothesis is that would be in a city. And the way to pick your actual location would be to get some data on foot traffic, find the most highly trafficked areas near other similar competing products, and just be willing to show off and compete with local U.S. competitors. You are looking to steal share from a fragmented market. So you're going to have to go and show that you can do that. So I think a flagship store in some of these top cities, thinking initially, San Francisco, New York, some of these more high rent places is a good idea. I would definitely pursue an omni-channel strategy and think about online. That's an expensive and lower margin strategy, but that is something that is huge in the US and something you would absolutely want to consider. Those are two channels that I think are going to be very, very high cost. I think in the lower cost channels, I think the word mass market, mass retail may have turned you off a little bit there, but I was thinking still a similar strategy to what sounds like they're pursuing in Japan. So very high-end retailers. Once upon a time I would have maybe said Barney's, but they've just filed for Chapter 11. So let's drop Barney's and let's say something else. Let's say Saks Fifth. I would check out Saks Fifth. I would check out Neiman Marcus. I would look at some of the still relatively successful brick and mortar stores. I would check out Sephora, and I would look at Whole Foods. I think that is still a demographic of people that you're targeting, and there are very premium, very expensive sections of Whole Foods. That would be maybe as quote unquote mass as I would get, but it's still organic. Or I would check out some of those very specialty supermarkets. So that's kind of higher margin, lower cost end. I would consider distributing through a bigger retail that way. And then maybe we can get really creative, right? We can think about similar but different strategies to what Burt's Bees did, partnering with hotels, as I would consider partnering and just kind of showing out your product in a variety of interesting places. So we could try the hotel thing, absolutely. We could try some high-end spas, that could work. We could, you could go to some special holiday destinations that tend to attract the people that love organic stuff. So go to Aspen, go to Vail, maybe go to those big music festivals. Go to maybe Burning Man's the wrong one, but go pick a music festival that has your kind of high-end, crunchy granola, organic loving crowd, and set up some kind of participating thing there, right? So these are all sort of on your higher margin, lower cost strategies that will still kind of get your name out there. And I think that's your initial step. That's your initial step for your foothold. I do think, and we do have to test. I mean, it's okay. I think that we disagree on this initially. I understand the family has a deep reluctance to be associated with anything mass market, given how premium they are. But if they want to make it in the U.S., I think they will need to make sure that they are in retail stores, successful ones, whether that's Neiman Marcus or Saks Fifth or Whole Foods or Sephora. I think that is the end goal. They can show velocity. Right now, all they have is Velocity International. Our goal, first goal, as we establish a foothold, should be to show sales velocity in the U.S. domestically with U.S. customers. Online is not the best way to show it. You do need to use some of the pop-up stores. You got to use some of these like music events, kind of these partnerships with other retailers. But once you demonstrate that, I do think that ultimately we can get to a position where we're showcasing our products on like premium shelf space, and we can get the attention of the people who are shopping in this very fragmented market.
So Matthew, if you were thinking about year one, and let's assume that Beauty and the Bees has a fixed capacity in terms of financial and human resources.
Yes.
What of those really interesting creative ideas, either which one would you do? Let's say you could only pick one or two of them. Which one
How would you prioritize?
How would you prioritize, and what would maybe be the outcome, or what do you sense could be the best of that list of ideas?
So that depends on how my hypothesis shakes out and whether I can create stakeholder buy-in with the controlling family of this product. If the hypothesis is that we need to be selling through retailers, we need to be going through distributors, then the priority step is to show US velocity. It would be two things. The first from the high margin category and the second from like the lower margin category. The first high margin one, open one flagship store. Open it in a very hip location. Do it San Francisco, do New York. You are going to need that location to kind of do a lot of the marketing buzz and have people come in and try samples. You need that. That's the sort of low margin priority one. Priority two is going to be higher margin. Is I think you bank off of the sales velocity in other countries and see if you can get into a premium retailer right now. They're not going to give you the best shelf space. They're not going to sort of really help you out. But if you can get in there, you can start showing consumers that you are kind of everywhere and you're becoming a thing. So I think those would be my two. Again, assuming that we can get them buy-in around the retailer thing. If that is just not something we can get buy-in from the client on, then I actually think the priorities are different. The priority is to just do more sort of low-key, let's call it like grassroots support and build it from the ground up. I still think you want that flagship store, but instead of going through a retailer, I think you start creating buzz you go to the customer directly and you do buzz at festivals, you do pop-up stores at places they frequent. So I think that's a little bit more manpower intensive and it's more involving the marketing department than just sales. But I think, again, it depends on what your end goal is. My suggestion strongly really is retail, but again, that's something we would work with the client on.
Got it. Okay. So let's, throw in there for the sake of your thinking, the the family, the CEO and the patriarch of the family, would be open to a premium retailer as long as it's befitting of the brand. I think the mass market that they're trying to avoid is the Targets and the Walgreens
of
the world.
So the
way you've you've defined it makes a lot more sense. So take that input into consideration as you progress forward.
Great. And then last question, I guess, is sort of the final step of answering. We've answered year one, I think. We have our priorities, given that we're going to a premium retailer. What does year, let's say 10, 15 look like? Is this going to stay, is the U.S. just going to stay a part of this portfolio? Or is the family thinking about exiting at maybe a higher valuation? There is a strong desire to consolidate a lot of these brands under one roof. You see that with Coty and the amount of debt-funded M&A they're willing to do. The question is, for me, is whether the family wants to continue to play in a fragmented market that is going to be increasingly consolidated by big names, and whether they're willing to fight for it and take the margin hit to defend their position, or if they want to sell out. And I think depending on what the answer there is, that will actually affect our how we want to set the business up from the get-go. So right now we've proceeded, I think, on the assumption they want to hold on to this portfolio and they're willing to defend it, and we're setting this up for profitable growth. If, however, they're thinking that, you know what, maybe in 10 years the market's going to be so consolidated we should sell, we should be thinking about sales at the expense of margin. And that looks like year one looks very different, because we need to create an investment thesis for potential buyers. So I do want to toss that out there and say, looking at the market, there's a tremendous amount of consolidation going on. There's a lot of buyer interest. Opportunity to sell, raise cash, at the same time, could get very tricky in like 10 years to defend your position as a small player.
Certainly, and the family thinks a lot about that. I think for your input, this is a third generation run company. It's Greek. They're very proud of their Greek heritage. As you may know, the Greek economy has struggled tremendously. This is one of the bright spots. There's also a huge Greek American community that I think they're very excited to potentially embrace. And, no one would ever say never, but I do think that the family sees that, they admire some of the leading companies that have maintained ownership through generations, like Cargill and Bunde in Argentina. So for the foreseeable future, I think they're willing to be feisty and proud as Greeks. Obviously, 10 years down the road, things may change, but probably, they're not interested in some sort of quick value-driven exit.
Got it. And I think that's one thing that we haven't really dug super deep into, in part because that's very much more the marketing department. But there is something to be said about Greece, right? This is where people go for. If you're really young, you're partying in Mykonos. If you're older, you're going to sort of quieter spots in Greece, but still enjoying this one fantastic. Well, there's this aura around Greece that maybe hasn't really been capitalized on. You think about the way some products from Italy or even from Turkey have been marketed as, super organic and kind of newly discovered and sort of part of this Mediterranean lifestyle that's healthy and good for you. Or if you go further afield, think about how people have marketed tech in Korea as kind of, cosmeceutical, as they say, right? The sort of the scientific application of cosmetics. We haven't really seen that with Greece, and there's probably many reasons why we haven't looked into it. That'd be an exercise. But I think there's a marketing opportunity here for sure to think about how you monetize this image that people have of Greece. No matter how the Greek economy is going, you are tying this to the image of the Mediterranean and the lifestyle of how people look ageless and they stay young and live for long periods of time and they're healthy and eat fish, this whole thing. So there is something to be said there for both the Greek American population and the larger U.S. population on this idea of this being a Greek product.
Mhm. No, I think that's an interesting observation. It's probably one of the reasons why the product has done so well in Japan. They
Yeah.
leverage that. They don't have issues with, GMO products and synthetic products like some other companies do. And that exoticness has certainly carried them into some of these other international destinations.
Yeah.
And clearly, I think the family recognizes that is not something that they did in their previous entry into the U.S. So they under-leveraged that part of their competitive advantage.
Got it. I think that makes sense because otherwise you're just sort of one of many premium brands. I think there's really an opportunity to beef up the marketing on this. One thing I think I'm pretty much ready to make a recommendation on whether or not they should take this. I think the big question for me is sort of two questions, I guess. One, what other options are they looking at? So given that they're going to be making an investment into the U.S., I would want to know what the fixed costs of this would look like and how long it would take to pay this back. And I would also want to think about what their opportunity costs are for that fixed cost. Like where else could they be better deploying this capital? We think that they can be making, $30 million a year, right? So what are they investing in the U.S. to make that work?
I think that's an unknown question. I mean, they have explored entering via a retail flagship store like you were talking about. I think they believe that, they could spend anywhere from $30,000 to $50,000 a month on a retail location based on some initial scouting. If you throw in some marketing, again, based on some of their other experiences, but they haven't fully developed a perspective. I do think they know that they've been able to enter some of these other markets with minimal investment or, 2 to 3 year paybacks that have been very satisfying to the business. Hopefully they'd be able to leverage that model, but again, the U.S. is a very different market.
Yeah. Okay, understand. So it sounds like in terms of next steps, before we move on, in terms of next steps, I think there's an immediate one in terms of thinking about what the fixed costs will be. We have a sense that in terms of profits, it seems like a reasonably doable one, but honestly, I don't think we should move forward super aggressively until we identify exactly what the fixed costs will be and identify and validate whether a 2 or 3 year payback period would work. The second is we should assess this against the opportunity cost. So we should understand what else they could be spending this money on, this initial investment, and whether the return on that would actually match what they were putting in. So until we have a fixed cost number, that's not kind of an analysis we can do up front. So let's say that that's the sort of second thing we should do. And the third is we should simultaneously open up conversations in terms of the sales strategy, potentially what that looks like. So I think that's a conversation we have in parallel. So we should start reaching out to property agents in some of these cities to sort of look at what flagship store locations look feasible. And at the same time, I would start talking to the marketing department and figuring out how we can really leverage this sort of Greek and organic and premium image that we have, and then find out what partners we can kind of link up with that would fit there. So I think those are kind of the immediate 3 next steps. Let me know if you disagree. But I think that sort of combines two things. One is the financial return. I don't feel comfortable saying with 100% certainty this makes financial sense for them. It seems reasonably like a good idea, but until we know what the fixed cost is, I don't think we can make an assessment. And finally, I think the sales strategy, we have a pretty strong hypothesis on what that would look like. But let's find out more whether that makes sense based on running numbers after we talk to property agents and the marketing department comes back.
Great. So you're going to go and have a lunch meeting with the Chief Strategy Officer. That individual has happened to come to Chicago for their own vacation, kind of a reversal of situations. And you guys are going to have a conversation about what you've learned. So what do you want to present to that person in terms of your analysis to this point?
Got it. So I will say there's 3 things I want to talk about. The first is just sort of looking at some preliminary back of envelope numbers. We think this looks like, it could be a $30 or $40 million a year profit opportunity. The market, in terms of the U.S. market, is attractive. It's growing at double digits. So it's very, very fragmented. It's growing very, very quickly. There's room for you guys to grab, a 5% share, which is what the 30, 40 million represents. In terms of your go-to-market strategy, you should be pursuing kind of a combination of two things. The first is grabbing a flagship store, putting your name out there, making sure there's foot traffic in and out, and sampling your products to create buzz, and also to actually get a foot in the door with some premium retailers. And you can leverage some of the data you have, your sales velocity from your current sales. And third, I want to discuss some next steps with you. I think the 30 or 4 million a year, could be good. That's an attractive number for a small retailer, but I'm not sure we know enough about what the fixed cost would look like in terms of entering the U.S. I think it's an immediate next step we need to do. We should look at what it took to enter the market where you have where you're working with high-end premium retailers. That's probably Japan. Let's look at what your fixed costs look like there. Let's really validate whether a 2 to 3 year payback is realistic and whether it's acceptable to the company given how they could better spend those funds if there's something that would yield a better return. So I think we have some next steps, and I have some homework ahead of me. I'll get in contact with your CFO if you're willing to put me in touch with him, and we can get some of these numbers. We can start validating some of these initial analyses.
Okay. Great. Okay. Thank you, Matthew. If everyone could do a virtual applause for Matthew, or, take yourself off mute and do some applause up to your microphone.
It's been a while. Oh my God.
Okay. So we're going to let Matthew take a break. And if you guys want to formulate some questions, Matthew, one of the requests that I have is if you might be willing to share your notes, if you've taken them.
Sure.
And if you can, maybe take a snapshot with your phone. Don't make a big deal, or, next time when I'm home, I'll come by and pick them up. But if you're willing, people are always trying to get insights about, the note-taking process. I also wrote down some notes.
If you
I
guys
wrote
can
down
read
Matthew's,
it, I'm happy to share.
Yeah. So if Matthew can't exactly give you guys his notes, I think I wrote down what his structure was. So I'll share that as well. All right. So questions, there's quite a few people online. You guys are welcome to ask them live of Matthew. Just take yourself off mute. I'll try to facilitate. Otherwise, if you have questions, put them in the chat and then I'll pass them along. So please, anyone throw out anything. This is fair game. I think it's fair to say, Matthew, you don't really sit in the recruiting process too much. So nobody, should feel any sense of, this is a learning environment. We'll just say that.
Yeah.
Questions. Usually it takes a minute for us to get warmed up, but then they'll flow like crazy.
Hey, we can talk about the case as well if you have questions on what I was thinking or what I think could have gone better or anything.
Yeah. I heard someone speaking a question, so please go ahead.
I have a general question. And Matthew, thank you so much for walking through this. This is Yishang. I'm part of Pam's Catalyst program. I noticed throughout the case you suggested hypotheses, not just at the beginning, but when you stated an assumption, you also, or you would state a hypothesis and say, this is my assumption behind it. Is that pretty typical for at every stage, or should you first ask someone for the information before you kind of make an assumption or hypothesis?
So this is with the caveat that I've only ever worked at BCG. McKinsey may do things differently. For BCG, we like to be answer-led. So every meeting we go into, and the cases are simulating these multiple meetings, right? You can imagine that a case in 30 minutes, you are simulating a 4-month, 3-month engagement. So each of these kind of analyses you can think of as a meeting with the client. And every time you go in the client meeting, you're going to go in probably not knowing as much as you'd like. And so you're going to state assumptions and hypotheses. You're going to put a stake in the ground. and you're you are using the meeting to discuss that initial perspective. If anyone's ever worked in tech or is familiar with tech, you're working agile, right? You're going to go into a meeting with version 1.0, and your hope is you come out of the meeting with version 2. You don't ever want to go into a meeting with version Z, with nothing, with the hopes of, by committee, you're going to get to version 1. So you as a consultant are going to go in with a perspective, and you're going to put a stake in the ground, and it could very well be wrong. So like I went in and I was like, this is my hypothesis for like each stage, for each meeting, right? Like my hypothesis is X. My assumptions for that are Y. Let's discuss. Here's why it's a good idea. Here's what the consequences are. Discuss. Maybe I'm entirely wrong, and that is okay because we can get wrong fast. And sometimes I preface these things either in real life with meetings, and we say this all the time in real meetings, but I've done this in the case too. I just say, let's get wrong fast. This is my hypothesis. These are my assumptions. This is why I think these are the right hypotheses to make and why these assumptions are good, but let's be wrong fast. Maybe this is just totally wrong. Does that answer your question?
Mm-hmm.
That did. Yes. Thank you so much.
And if I could piggyback on that, it maybe even be really tactical, Matthew. I mean, in the interview setting, do you find that it is proper technique to say, hey, this is my hypothesis or this is my thinking? Like, is that the language that you should be using in the interview?
Yes, I think particularly at BCG, that is the language they're looking for. They're looking for you to have hypotheses and state your assumptions. Mm-hmm. Certainly your assumptions, in every, no matter what company you're applying to, your assumptions are going to be critical. Certainly for BCG, using the word hypothesis and having one, I think is good. When people say like, oh, I want the candidate to drive the case, what they really mean by that is you take yourself out of the interview setting. They're looking for signs that when you're a real consultant on the ground, you are going to go into these meetings with hypotheses and put a stake in the ground. Like that's actually what they're training for. So at every stage, I think it's very valuable to use the word hypothesis and assumptions and be explicit about what those are and what your thinking is, because they're trying to see how you think.
Yep, that's fair. I have a question I'm going to ask based on a text, and then I'll come back to the group to ask if anyone has any live questions. So there's a question, Matthew, about the market sizing estimation. And, where do you, I think if I interpret this, what is typically done in market sizing? So you used population, right? And then, so this is the US, right? So it was a fairly, I guess, easy, but I could have easily said, this is a company based in Napa Valley that wants to go into, Southeast Asia. Most of us wouldn't know the population of the countries of Southeast Asia. So how do you have that fact base at the ready? And did you find in your interview process that you needed to have other approaches to market sizing?
So I'll answer two questions here. One is about the factoids. Two is about methodology. Let's do factoids first because that's easy. Methodology is a bit harder. Factoids. Pam knows this. I came up with a list of factoids I thought would be useful. So I know I can no longer do this, but I did at one point could estimate for you, like based on the major cities in Southeast Asia, here's roughly the kind of population we've been talking about, right? So it is helpful to have a couple factoids at your disposal. So, financial cities in the world tend to roughly be 7 million people. Like that's like an easy one. I think Shanghai is 10, but like you would be safe in guessing 7. Like smaller cities like Chicago, that's 3 million. San Francisco is like under 1 million, small. Know some of these factoids. It is helpful to have, but so that's kind of where that came from. So that's an easy one. Go look up a couple. Ask Pam to share some factoids that I made, if that's helpful. I think I sent that to her. Methodology. So if everyone always picks up for some reason, I'm like, oh, he started with the U.S. population. That's not where I started off with. I started off by saying I walked across Sephora, and here's what I saw. So every good consultant will base their market sizing on observation. It is a terrible idea to just start with the population because then you're flying blind. You're like, well, like the logic has to be driven by observation because it's all common sense. This happens all the time. This is like real life. I do this every week. I'll be in a meeting and they'll just ask a question, and I'll say, well, okay, let's just size it here. You want to know who buys your candy? I was just in, X store, 7-Eleven, whatever, and these are the people I saw buying your candy. They're boys. They are roughly this age. This is what I saw. This is how often I think they were buying them. Based on what I saw, I then say, okay, well, how many boys of that age are there roughly in this city that go to 7-Eleven, right? Like that is, you back out that, and you can do that from population, but always do it from the observation. So there's a market size I always give when people ask me, like, how do you do this? If I ask you how many people fly in and out of an airport, you're not starting with the city population. That's insane. You're going to start with, like, how many planes do I see taxiing from my gate? Like, you all sit in front of an airport gate all the time, right? Like, you are at the gate. How many planes taxi, like, land on the tarmac in an hour, every 5 minutes, every 10 minutes? How many times do you see a plane? How many people are in the plane? You go from there. So the way to do it is always rooted in observation. The factoids are helpful because population tends to work well for market entry style questions, where someone's like, I want to go, this happens a lot in case interviews, right? Like, I am a Greek company and I want to go to the US. Okay, great. Well, like, US population makes sense. But this all started with, I walked past Sephora and I noticed that it's mostly women, and it's women between 20 and 60.
Yeah. So what
I
think what you're saying, I think what I'm hearing you say, Matthew, is you have to have a way to cut the population. You have to be able to break it down into some further segmentation that is based on some kind of behavior or buying characteristic or group. You have to subgroup the population in some way, and you're saying do that from your own observation. In some cases,
and even if,
right?
Where possible. Observation or relatable experience.
So I had another question related.
Sure.
Are there circumstances where your market sizing might be more bottoms up?
Yes, 100%. Bottom up tends to be, you would want to triangulate if you had time, and so this was not the case to suggest that. You wouldn't really triangulate up from here. But you should almost, where it's possible to do both a top and a bottom up analysis, you would want to offer to triangulate both. So here's a really, really good example. There's a market sizing one that I did once. A friend asked me, I don't really play this video game, so I don't know. But they're like, there is a video game owned by Blizzard. It's called Hearthstone. It's a card trading game. I'm like, I have no idea what this is. Like, tell me what their profit is. And I was like, so because I was a securities lawyer, I was like, okay, I'm going to do a top-down analysis. I'm going to go look at the Blizzard Activision, like 10K, figure out what the segment is, and like kind of work out to the profit. And he was like, the better answer is to offer to triangulate. What you do is you go to Twitter, or you go to Reddit, or you go to Twitch, all these sites where gamers congregate, look at viewer numbers, look at the amount of viewers on each of these sites, get an average for it, figure out the amount of spend per user, multiply that by the number of users you saw on Reddit or Twitch or Twitter that are subscribed or following the Hearthstone stuff, and work up to a sales. And then in terms of profit, maybe you just apply the company profit because it's probably the same. So that's a bottom up and a top down. Average the two, or just find something that makes sense using those two data points, and you have your better answer. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It does. I mean, I'm thinking about, because I'm sitting here in a coffee shop. It's like, if I wanted to estimate how many cups of coffee Starbucks sells every year, I could do it at the store level, and then I could extrapolate it to X number of stores. That would be bottoms up. I could certainly go from the U.S. population down to coffee drinkers to what, market share Starbucks has. That would be top down. So I think that's a really great question that someone's asked, is how do you do, top down versus bottoms up? What Matthew's suggesting is sometimes you do both because it helps you validate, right? Sometimes you're going to do one, you're going to do the other. There's some judgment that goes in there.
And to add to that, I would say err on the side of the observed one, right? So like the Starbucks coffee question, you are not going to be able to observe the percentage of coffee drinkers in the U.S. population. You can observe the number of people that go up and like pay for a coffee at Starbucks, right? Like every minute they serve 2 people, right? And there you go,
Fair.
1 person, whatever.
Yep.
So like that's a better way of doing it.
Great. Other questions, please. Okay.
Hi, Pam.
I have
Hi, Matthew.
another-
Thank you both.
Welcome.
I'm actually curious about kind of more of the way that you kind of engage in the case. It's really noticeable, the energy and the enthusiasm, and also just the cadence with which you're solving the case. Is that kind of curious if you could speak to 2 things. Number one, is that just sort of natural to your personality and the way that you work through problems? And 2, just from the perspective of thinking about candidates for firms like BCG where you work, what importance would you put on that, if any, for folks that you're thinking about in the interview process?
Got it. Okay, so to answer your first question, I'm a fairly bubbly, high energy, kind of happy person. So to begin, I enjoy this sort of thing. I enjoy my job. So yes, I am naturally kind of a happy, excited person. This is kind of you get 2 smart people in the room, and presumably this case is something that maybe they've actually worked on in real life. And that's pretty cool, just to kind of find out more. So that's number 1. Number 2, in terms of how you should carry yourself in the room, I think that is a context-dependent, read the room kind of situation. So I have learned to tone down my enthusiasm depending on the clients I serve. So, if the client seems like he's not as bubbly or happy or enthusiastic, I would tone that down and just be a bit more serious. I would smile less. I'd maybe sort of be more dour if need be. So adjust. I would err on the side of being happy and excited first, and then I would immediately adjust if that was not the case with the client. But don't just err on just one personality, because sometimes that comes off as people being like, oh, he doesn't have the presence or whatever. Whereas someone who is not that way would be like, he's going to be great with clients. He's such high energy. So you just need to learn how to read the room, and you'll figure out pretty quickly. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you. I think that it makes a lot of sense. I feel similar, just around like getting excited about the problem solving nature. I was just kind of curious getting your insight on that. I think that's exactly the right and very logical answer.
Yeah. And here's one that'll actually, a question I guess I'll pose to Pam. I'm sort of curious what your thoughts are. I think when I was going through the process, I would have never dared to put a stake in the ground as strongly as I did today. I think having worked in the job more, I've realized that one of the values I bring is if I feel strongly about something because of data or press experience, I've worked in this industry a little bit, like the consumer products industry, I will take a very firm stake, and I'll say, maybe we've understood, or like, we would need to get stakeholder buy-in, but like, I'm going to take a very firm position. I'm curious what you think of that, Pam, because I think that is a little bit different in a case interview context versus the actual case. Like, I have rapport with my clients. It's different when I take a strong stance versus I think there's a potential risk in an interview setting of you coming off as, like not listening. So I'm curious. I don't want people to take away the wrong thing from that.
I think that's a fair assessment. I mean, I actually have had a couple questions about like, what's our evaluation of how you did on this case? How does it compare to an interview setting? Our dynamic. I mean, I think I would say a couple things. So number one, what you guys heard from Matthew, I would say, even probably one of the very first cases I did with you, Matthew, your style is more aggressive. So, part of it is you're trained as a lawyer, and I know a lot of lawyers. I've had a lot of clients who are lawyers. There is something about that training and the style of engagement but you all should take note of that, because I do think that especially for the bigger strategy firms, the larger firms, there's an assertiveness that is expected. There is this idea of here's what I'm thinking, putting that stake in the ground, I actually think is necessary. So Matthew, you may have done it here a little more edgy because now you're on the other side of the table, and you may have, well, you may have in the circumstance when you were interviewing as a candidate, you might have been a little more deferential to
absolutely
the data, right? As opposed to saying, this is my thinking, and the family ought to do this and they need to do this. You might have said, well, let me understand. You might have asked a couple more questions. But I think for everyone here, the idea is to be as far down the client ready runway as possible in the interview setting. And, that piece of it, I do think is a valuable takeaway. I wanted to sort of ask you, Matthew, like the pace of how you and I were going back and forth, how did that, if you could give these guys a little bit of insight into what does the interview room look like and your engagement with the interviewer from your memory, how compare and contrast what we just did versus the real interview room, could you?
Yeah, sure. So I can only do for BCG because that's the one I picked and interviewed with and got an offer at. So I didn't interview elsewhere. Again, in retrospect, would not have suggested this, but it worked out fine. BCG's interviews are very, very short. So our interviews are like 20 minutes tops. So what I really enjoyed about this one is there's a lot more room to explore and talk and brainstorm and kind of really engage with the case. With BCG, you are going to find that the case is much, much shorter. You're going to set up your framework, you're going to answer data, and the data will come immediately. Like I think with Pam, I really got a chance to kind of develop and think about what data I would want and ask for it. If I didn't ask for it, I wouldn't get it. That is not the case. At BCG, they're going to give it to you immediately, like on 3 sheets of paper, and you'll get to solve it like straight away. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind is
it's a handout, right? Is it a
it's typically a handout.
Yep.
Or they'll give it to you, or they might just.
And that's the first round, right? Even in the first round, you're going to get handouts. Is that correct, or is that more for second round?
Yes. Well, I think both rounds they usually give you a handout, but they might have some data just verbally given to you. But when I did it, there was a written case. I think we've actually gotten rid of it. I don't think we do that anymore. It's something, again, I'm not super plugged into recruiting, so you'll have to talk to your recruiter about that. But yeah, so just keep in mind that for BCG, it's 20 minutes. And McKinsey, I think, is long. I think McKinsey does like a full 40-minute interview, but I don't remember. Whereas BCG is very short. So keep in mind for BCG, expect something half this pace. You're going to be given the data immediately, and right off the data, the data is going to be like very clear on what it should be. BCG doesn't like to hide the ball in the interviews, so you'll have like a relatively clear perspective on the data. Like, here's your fixed cost. And then you're going to have like either the like payback period, either going to be like 2 or 3 years, or it's going to be like 30. And you're going to have, it's not going to be this weird, it's not going to be in between. They're going to give you 8 and have you figure out like wishy-washy. They're going to either give you 1 or 2 or 30, and you'll just be like, the payback period will be long. Like, is that fine? Well, probably not. And then you'll have a discussion of how would you mitigate it, right? So BC is very fast.
Yep. And maybe just a comment for everybody. So I think I may have commented on this in the past, and you guys may be learning this, but each firm has a slightly different style. And, it's incumbent upon you to be learning that firm's style. The first round, even within firms, might be different than the second round. So it can be a little bit tricky. The core fundamentals are going to carry you across firms. So ideally, if you're interviewing with multiple firms, the basics are going to be transferable, but there's going to be certain things that I think you have to learn that are more important. a couple little details, I know Bain has got an upcoming case workshop that some of you may attend. They'll talk about their style. You'll get a chance to network with BCG consultants or McKinsey consultants or E&Y consultants, learn a little bit about their interview style, and some of the alumni will tell you that. A question has come in about brainstorming. So when doing your brainstorming on marketing the product, you just kind of started brainstorming. How do you? One of the things I think occasionally people will say is you should organize your brainstorm, but I think yours felt a little more like a list. So what would you say about brainstorming?
I think being organized is good. I think you want to organize it. If you think about how I organized the brainstorming here in terms of sales strategy, I was like, okay, there's your high margin and your low margin type of sales strategy, right? Like your higher margin is going to be like these marketing pop-up things, whatever. The lower margins, you're opening a flagship store, a brick and mortar, that's hard. So like you still want to kind of bucket so people can follow and see there's a logic. I think when it came to marketing, I initially wasn't thinking about talking too much about marketing. I really wanted to stick with the financials and like sales strategy. But when it became apparent that, Pam wanted to talk about marketing, she gave me like a lead, I guess. She was like, we're into Greek and they're really proud of the Greek Americans. And so I was like, okay, well, let's have a conversation about what you just talked about. So I think it depends, right? Like in a situation where it's fluid, where Pam has just brought something up and it's a conversation, respond organically to what she said. If it's an open-ended, how would you market this? When it's that open-ended, it's on you to figure out an organization for it, because that way you'll actually have more ideas and be more interesting. But if they're just going back and forth, just respond back and forth. There's no need to be too rigid about it. That's my thought.
Excellent. Okay, maybe one more question and then we will wrap up. Anybody live want to ask a question directly of Matthew? Everybody's all questioned out. Any questions about anything? It doesn't even have to be about this case.
Yeah.
Before we wrap up. Practice tips, interview tips.
I've kind of a general question. Matthew, you touched a little bit on BCG and just like the different things BCG looks for. On the flip side, are there some common mistakes you see in BCG interviews? I don't know if you've been on the other side of the table at some point.
I have not been on the other side of the interview, but I have friends who are. I think the there's two common mistakes, I think. The first common mistake is being too afraid of taking a stand on a second order insight. So a really good example of that is let's say we got the payback period, and payback period is like 15 years. And the most common mistake is the interviewer will say, okay, so it's great, 15 years sounds right. What do you think? And they'll be like, I don't know, like, is that long? And it's like, commonsensically, 15 years is really long, right? That's really, really long. Take a stand and say, that sounds really long to me. I want a benchmark in case that's not true, but that sounds like an insanely, prohibitively long amount of time, and you would want your capital deployed elsewhere, right? Like that, take that stand. I think a lot of interviewers they tell me that, especially people that aren't MBAs, will just like not take that stance. That's number one. Number two is they don't talk about their thinking process. So you give them a bunch of data, and then they'll just say, okay, well, the answer is X. It's like, okay, that's helpful, and that's correct, but I'd like to kind of hear how you got there as opposed to the like 30 seconds of silence. That's with math. Another one is logic. So if I ask you like, okay, walk me through what you think, and if I just come right out and say the answer is premium retailing, okay, maybe that's true, maybe it's not. Walk me through how you got there. So I think those are the two most common mistakes. Take a stand on a second order insight. Doesn't mean you take a stand as aggressively as I did earlier today, but for God's sake, take a stand when you get something like really, really obvious, right? Like 15 years payback, or is it worth it? And you're like, oh, actually, the company's going to lose $500,000 a year if they do this opportunity. Like, that is a bad idea. Like, you don't have to, waffle on it. Losing $500,000 a year, bad idea, not good. You can say maybe there's some mitigating, but I would almost certainly say no unless there was a mitigating reason, right? And you say it that way, that's great. But that is a second order insight. Put your foot in the ground for that.
Cool. Okay.
Fantastic. Thank you,
All right.
Matthew.
Okay, everyone. Well, again, Matthew, I want to just thank you. I'm always so grateful to you for your contribution, your insight, your time. Thanks, everybody, for taking the time out tonight, and I hope you guys enjoyed this. I will be doing some additional things following this. I'll post a recording. I'll post the case notes. And then in our 8th session, that is 2 weeks from tonight, I may spend a little bit of time at the front end of that, going through a little bit more of this case and feedback. And then my last statement, don't forget to register for the case practice that we're doing the 3rd week of August. The BCC sent out the note about that. We have about 20 spots remaining. So if you're interested in a actual one-on-one case to kind of put some of this learning into action, that's going to be a great opportunity. So thanks again, everybody. Good night. And Matthew, thank you so much. Take care, everyone.
Glad to meet you all.
Good night.
Thanks so much.